A new face at Rose's. Rose's place smelled of frying bacon, strong coffee, and the sweet, yeasty promise of homemade cinnamon rolls. Sunlight streamed through the checkered curtains, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. It wasn't fancy, never had been. Rosie herself, bless her soul, had started the place back in '52, serving up hearty meals to the factory workers down the street. Now, 3 generations later, Rose's granddaughter, Emily, kept the tradition alive, same recipes, same faded floral wallpaper, same comforting aroma. Mark Davis adjusted his tie, feeling a bead of sweat trickle down his back. This wasn't exactly where he pictured himself at 25. He'd imagined corner offices, power lunches, and maybe a personal assistant named Tiffany. Instead, he was wiping down sticky tables at Rose's, wearing an unflattering beige apron. A bell chimed above the door, announcing a new arrival. An elderly woman, her face etched with wrinkles, shuffled in, leaning heavily on a cane. Mark sighed inwardly. Just what he needed. He plastered on what he hoped was a charming smile. "Table for one?" he asked, the words clipped and impatient. "Yes, dear," the woman replied, her voice thin and reedy. "Near the window, if you please." Mark led her to a booth by the window, practically throwing the menu down in front of her. "I'll be back to take your order," he mumbled, already turning away before she could respond. He strode back to the counter, where Sarah Miller was meticulously arranging pastries in the display case. "Slow day, hey," he said, leaning against the counter. Sarah, a wisp of a woman with perpetually worried eyes, glanced up. "It's steady," she said softly. "Mr. Henderson will be in soon for his usual slice of apple pie." "Great," Mark muttered. More geriatric entertainment. He caught Sarah's disapproving frown. "What?" "It's the truth. They take forever to order, they complain about everything, and they tip like they're still living in the Great Depression." Sarah carefully placed a cherry on top of a chocolate eclair. "They're just looking for a little comfort, Mark. This place is important to them." "Comfort doesn't pay the bills," Mark retorted, grabbing a coffee pot and heading towards the elderly woman's table. "Have you decided yet?" he asked, not bothering to hide the irritation in his voice. The woman peered at the menu, her brow furrowed. "So many choices," she murmured. "The meatloaf sounds nice, but I'm not sure I can eat a whole portion." Mark tapped his pen impatiently against his order pad. "Well, make up your mind," he snapped. "I don't have all day." The woman flinched, her eyes widening slightly. She pointed a trembling finger at the menu. "Just a cup of tea, then," she said quietly. Mark scribbled it down, barely acknowledging her. As he walked away, he could feel Sarah's gaze boring into his back. He knew she disapproved. He didn't care. He was just trying to get through the day, to earn enough money to escape this dead-end town and prove to everyone, including himself, that he was worth something. Later, Sarah found Mark wiping down tables with unnecessary force. "Mark," she said hesitantly, "that wasn't very nice, the way you spoke to Mrs. Gable." Mark stopped scrubbing and turned to face her, his jaw tight. "Look, I'm busy, okay? I don't have time for sensitivity training." "But she's a regular," Sarah persisted, her voice barely a whisper. "She comes here every week." Rosie knew her husband. "So what?" Mark said, his voice rising. "I'm not Rosie. I'm just trying to do my job." Sarah sighed, her shoulders slumping. She knew arguing with Mark was pointless. He was like a tightly wound spring, ready to snap at any moment. She just hoped he wouldn't do something he'd regret. She moved back to the counter and resumed her work, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. This was Rose's place, a haven for the lonely and the weary. Mark didn't belong here. He was a storm cloud in a place that needed sunshine. Mr. Thompson's arrival. The entry chime, usually a background drone, clawed at Mark's frayed nerves. Trapped in Rose's, he was condemned to perpetually chase the ghosts of meals past, eradicating crumbs and mopping up spilled syrup. A figure materialized in the doorway, backlit by the blazing afternoon. Shielding his eyes, Mark recognized Thompson, the elder from the corner house. "Terrific," he muttered, draping the soiled rag across his shoulder. "Just what my shift needed." Thompson blinked, his gaze struggling to adjust to the diner's gloom. Fatigue etched deep valleys around his eyes, more pronounced than Mark recalled. A musty tweed jacket hung loosely on his frame, and each step relied heavily on a gnarled walking stick. He carried with him a faint aura of aged paper and moth repellent. As Thompson hobbled closer, a sneer tightened Mark's lips. "Misplaced your dentures, Pops," he drawled, each word laced with acid. "Blue plate specials long gone." Thompson seemed unfazed by the barb. A gentle, almost apologetic smile graced his lips. "Good afternoon," he greeted, his voice a gravelly murmur. "I was hoping for a table. Just for a little while." Mark exhaled dramatically, his eyes orbiting skyward. The cacophony from the kitchen amplified his mounting irritation. "We're slammed, can't you see?" Mark countered, flinging his hand to indicate the dining area, more empty than full. "No time to spoon-feed folks who need a bib." Thompson's smile momentarily flickered, then resettled. He straightened, a glint of resilience sparking in his weary eyes. "Rest assured, young man," he stated, a surprising strength ringing in his tone, "I am quite capable of managing my own sustenance. I simply seek a calm place for a coffee." Mark leaned against a recently wiped table, crossing his arms with a weary sigh. "Look, the crew's stretched thin. Can't afford to waste precious seating on customers who'll occupy it for hours nursing a single cup of joe." He nodded towards the sun-drenched street. "Sunshine's free of charge, Gramps. Go soak it up." Silence descended, laden with unvoiced animosity. Thompson held Mark's gaze, unblinking. Mark returned the stare, refusing to yield. He was sick of being a doormat, of being chained to this soul-crushing job, of the pitying glances he received. He wouldn't allow this old man to prick his conscience. Finally, Thompson sighed, a sound like a slow puncture. "Very well," he conceded, his voice reverting to its soft, gentle tone. "Perhaps another day." He turned with painstaking slowness, leaning hard on his cane, and began his retreat toward the exit. As he reached the doorway, he paused, glancing back. "Patience, young man," he uttered, barely audible. "It has a peculiar habit of returning full circle." Then, he crossed the threshold into the bright afternoon light, the chime tinkling softly in his wake. Mark watched him recede, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach, an emotion he couldn't readily define. Service denied. Mark Davis scrubbed at a ketchup stain with unnecessary force. Rose's diner was half empty on a Tuesday afternoon, the lunch rush a distant memory. He resented the lingering aroma of fried onions and felt the familiar sting of dissatisfaction prickle at his temples. This wasn't how he imagined his life. Not wiping tables for minimum wage in a greasy spoon diner. The bell above the door jingled, announcing a new arrival. Mark barely glanced up, continuing his assault on the ketchup stain. An older gentleman, leaning slightly on a polished wooden cane, shuffled in. He wore a tweed jacket that looked older than Mark himself, and his kind eyes held a perpetual twinkle. It was Mr. Arthur Thompson, a regular, a fixture of the Roses landscape for as long as Mark had been alive. "Afternoon, Arthur," Mark muttered, without making eye contact. Mr. Thompson smiled, a network of wrinkles deepening around his eyes. "Afternoon, Mark. Lovely day, isn't it? Just thought I'd pop in for a coffee and a slice of Rose's famous apple pie." He gestured towards a vacant booth by the window. "That one free." Mark finally looked up, his face a mask of forced indifference. "Sorry, Arthur. All tables are reserved." Mr. Thompson's smile faltered. He blinked, his gaze sweeping over the empty tables. "Reserved? But I don't see any signs." Mark shrugged, wiping his hands on his already stained apron. "Doesn't matter. They're reserved. Big party coming in later." He knew it was a lie. Rosie hadn't had a big party in years. The twinkle in Mr. Thompson's eyes dimmed, replaced by a quiet disappointment. "Oh," he said softly. He shifted his weight on his cane, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Well, perhaps another time then." He turned to leave, his gait slower now, heavier. The bell above the door jingled again as he exited, the sound almost mournful. Sarah Miller, behind the counter, had witnessed the entire exchange. Her brow furrowed, a knot of anger tightening in her chest. She watched Mr. Thompson disappear down the street, his figure growing smaller with each step. "Mark, what was that about?" she asked, her voice sharp. Mark avoided her gaze, returning to the ketchup stain he'd already obliterated. "What do you mean?" "You know exactly what I mean. You lied to Mr. Thompson. There are plenty of free tables." "Why did you do that?" He slammed the rag down on the table, finally meeting Sarah's eyes. "Because I felt like it, all right? Maybe I'm tired of serving everyone with a smile when my own life is in the toilet." He grabbed his cigarettes from his apron pocket, his hands shaking slightly. "Maybe I just wanted to feel like I had some control for once." He stormed out the back door, leaving Sarah staring after him, a mixture of anger and helplessness swirling within her. The diner felt colder now, the aroma of fried onions less appealing, the silence punctuated only by the hum of the refrigerator and the echo of Mr. Thompson's dejected "oh." A signal to Joe. Mr. Thompson's shoulders slumped imperceptibly. The rejection had been swift, a paper cut to his soul. He blinked, the fluorescent lights of Rose's diner reflecting in his watery eyes. He hadn't expected such blatant dismissal. The younger generation, he mused, often lacked a certain consideration. He reached for his worn tweed cap, the gesture slow, deliberate. Every movement seemed to carry the weight of years. He straightened his back, a subtle act of defiance against the sting of Mark's words. Then, with a sigh that barely stirred the air, he turned. Sarah watched him go, a knot tightening in her stomach. She wanted to shout, to tell Mark what a heartless fool he was, but she knew it wouldn't change anything. Mark was a brick wall, and Mr. Thompson deserved better than a scene. Helplessness gnawed at her. He was such a sweet man, always patient, always kind. She remembered his stories about Rosie, the diner's namesake, and the community she'd fostered within these very walls. It felt like Mark was chipping away at that legacy, one rude interaction at a time. As Mr. Thompson shuffled towards the door, Sarah knew she had to do something, anything. Her gaze darted towards the kitchen, towards the familiar silhouette of old Joe, his white apron stained with coffee and flour. She couldn't call out to him directly without alerting Mark and embarrassing Mr. Thompson further. Subtlety was key. She picked up a dirty plate, scraping at a stubborn piece of dried egg with unnecessary force, her eyes fixed on the kitchen doorway. She made a show of dropping the plate, letting it clatter loudly against the stainless steel sink. It wasn't a natural mistake, but the noise was her intention. As Joe's head popped out from the kitchen, Sarah widened her eyes and subtly tilted her head towards the departing figure of Mr. Thompson. She pursed her lips, forming a silent, almost imperceptible, "help." It was a signal they'd used before, a desperate plea whispered in the language of shared concern. Joe's brow furrowed. He scanned the diner, his gaze settling on Mr. Thompson's retreating back. He noticed the man's slow, deliberate pace, the slight droop of his shoulders. Something was off. His eyes flicked back to Sarah. He saw the worry etched on her face, the suppressed anger simmering beneath the surface. He knew that look. It meant trouble, specifically, trouble that involved someone being unkind to someone who didn't deserve it. A flicker of understanding sparked in his eyes, followed by a slow burn of anger. He didn't need Sarah to spell it out. He could read the room, read the unspoken stories etched in the lines of her face. He gave her a barely perceptible nod, a silent promise to investigate. The jovial twinkle in his eyes was gone, replaced by a steely glint. He wiped his hands on his apron, a gesture that somehow amplified the tension in the air. Something had happened, something that required his attention. And whatever it was, someone was about to answer for it. Joe remembers. Joe watched the old man shuffle out, head bowed, Mark practically shoving him towards the door. A spark, faint but insistent, flickered in the back of Joe's mind. He frowned, wiping down the counter with unnecessary force. There was something familiar about the set of that stoop back, the gentle curve of his shoulders. "Mark, get over here!" Joe barked, his voice louder than he intended. Mark sauntered over, a smirk playing on his lips. "What's up, old-timer? Need help reaching the syrup?" "That man," Joe said, pointing a gnarled finger towards the retreating figure outside. "You treat him with respect." Mark scoffed. "Respect?" He was taking up space, not buying nothing. "Time is money, Joe." Joe's blood ran cold. Rosie would have skinned him alive if she'd heard him talk like that. "You don't know who that is, do you?" Mark shrugged. "Some old geezer. What's the big deal?" The spark in Joe's mind ignited, becoming a roaring flame of memory. He grabbed Mark's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "That old geezer is Arthur Thompson." Mark just stared blankly. "So?" Joe released Mark's arm, shaking his head in disbelief. How could Mark be so ignorant? He saw a younger Arthur Thompson, brimming with energy, helping him and Rosie lug heavy crates of dishes into the empty storefront that would become Rose's diner. He remembered Arthur, a local carpenter back then, meticulously building the booths, his brow furrowed in concentration as he ensured every joint was perfect. He recalled Rosie, her face alight with gratitude, offering Arthur slices of her famous apple pie, warm from the oven. The air in the diner was thick with sawdust and anticipation. Rosie, her hair tied back in a bandana, stood back, surveying the progress. "Arthur, you're a lifesaver. I don't know what we would have done without you." Arthur, wiping sweat from his brow, smiled. "Rosie, it's my pleasure. This diner is going to be the heart of this town, you'll see. Everyone needs a place like this." He gestured around the half-finished space. "A place where they can feel at home." Joe, struggling to maneuver a heavy table, grunted in agreement. "He's right, Rosie. And your cooking, well, that's gonna draw them in from miles around." Rosie beamed, her eyes sparkling. "We'll make it work, together. This diner is for everyone." The memory faded, leaving Joe feeling strangely breathless. He looked at Mark, really looked at him, and saw only a callous indifference. The boy had no idea about the history of this place, the people who had poured their hearts and souls into making it what it was. "He helped build this place, Mark," Joe said, his voice low and dangerous. "He and Rosie, they were family." Mark rolled his eyes. "Whatever, Joe. I got customers to serve." He turned to leave, but Joe grabbed his arm again, his grip tighter this time. "You will apologize to Mr. Thompson," Joe said, his voice trembling with anger. "You will apologize, or you're fired." Joe's intervention. A clatter of pans echoed from the kitchen as Joe burst through the swinging door, his face a crimson mask of fury. "Hold on there, Mr. Thompson," he bellowed, ignoring Mark's sputtering protests. "Just hold your horses." Mark, halfway through wiping down a table, gaped. "Joe, what the hell? I'm trying to work here." He watched, dumbfounded, as the old man, usually a picture of slow, deliberate movements, surged forward with surprising speed. Joe barreled past him, a man possessed. He dodged a stack of placemats with the agility of someone half his age and practically flew towards the entrance. Mr. Thompson, his hand already on the door handle, turned, a question etched on his gentle features. The sunlight, streaming through the glass, haloed his silver hair, making him look even more fragile. Joe reached him just as he was about to step outside. "Mr. Thompson, please," Joe puffed, his chest heaving like a bellows. "Don't you go anywhere." "Not yet." He grasped Mr. Thompson's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. The old man didn't resist, but his brow furrowed with confusion. "Joseph, is everything all right? I thought I had overstayed my welcome." Overstayed? Nonsense. You're practically family, Mr. Thompson. Always have been, always will be. Joe's voice softened, the anger receding, replaced by a warmth that radiated outwards. He squeezed the old man's arm gently. I won't have you leaving feeling anything less than cherished. Rosie would never forgive me. Mark, still standing by the table, felt a knot of irritation tighten in his stomach. What was going on? He'd been perfectly clear. Mr. Thompson was done, finished, and out. Why was Joe suddenly acting like he was the guest of honor? He tossed the rag onto the table, the wet cloth making a dull slap. Joe, seriously, what's the big deal? He was leaving anyway. Joe shot him a look that could curdle milk. Mark, you go back to wiping tables. This is none of your concern. Mr. Thompson, sensing the tension, placed a reassuring hand on Joe's. Joseph, really, it's all right. Perhaps I should be going. I wouldn't want to cause any trouble. Trouble? You? Never. Joe boomed, his voice laced with genuine affection. He turned back to Mr. Thompson, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Come on, let's get you back to your booth. I've got a fresh pot of coffee brewing, and I want to hear all about your stamp collection. He gently steered Mr. Thompson back inside, away from the door and the beckoning sunlight. The old man allowed himself to be led, a faint smile playing on his lips. Mark watched them go, his anger simmering. He didn't understand. He felt a strange mix of resentment and confusion. He was the one stuck wiping tables, dealing with grumpy customers, while Joe fawned over some old geezer. He kicked the leg of the table, the metal groaning in protest. This wasn't fair. None of it was. A friend of Rose's. Mr. Thompson, my sincerest apologies. That young whippersnapper, Mark, he's got more mouth than sense sometimes. Old Joe extended a hand, his grip surprisingly firm despite his age. Please, come, sit. Let me get you a coffee and a slice of Rose's apple pie, on the house, of course. Mr. Thompson, his face etched with a network of fine lines that spoke of a life well lived, offered a gentle smile. Nonsense, Joe. No harm done. The boy's just young. We all were once. He settled into the worn booth, the vinyl creaking a familiar song. Joe bustled behind the counter, his movements surprisingly agile. Young is no excuse for disrespect, Arthur. Rosie wouldn't stand for it, and neither will I. He poured a steaming cup of coffee, the aroma filling the air with a comforting warmth. Rosie always said you were one of the kindest souls she ever knew. He placed the coffee and a generous slice of pie in front of Mr. Thompson. You remember, Arthur, back when Rosie first had the idea for this place. Just a dream, really. A place where everyone felt welcome, fed, and loved. You were the first to offer her help. Mr. Thompson took a sip of his coffee, his eyes twinkling. Rosie had the vision, Joe. All I did was offer a little guidance. And a small loan, of course. But it was Rose's heart that built this place. Her tireless energy, her unwavering belief in the good of people. He paused, a wistful look on his face. She used to say I was her steady hand, keeping her grounded when her dreams soared too high. Joe chuckled, leaning against the counter. High they certainly soared. And look at Rose's place now, a beacon of hope for so many. And you, Arthur, you were the one who helped her light that beacon. He lowered his voice, though his words carried easily in the nearly empty diner. Rosie told me once, not long before she passed, that you reminded her of her own father. A quiet strength, a deep well of compassion. Said you were a true friend, the kind that comes along only once in a lifetime. Mark, who had been sullenly wiping down tables, paused in his movements. He hadn't been paying attention to the specifics, but the reverence in Joe's voice and the mention of Rosie caught his ear. He'd heard stories about Rosie, of course, her legendary kindness and the home she'd created here. He'd always dismissed them as nostalgic drivel. He glanced at Mr. Thompson, taking in the man's gentle demeanor, the way his eyes lit up when he spoke of Rosie. He saw something in the elderly man's face he hadn't noticed before, a quiet dignity that commanded respect. Joe continued, oblivious to Mark's dawning realization. You know, Arthur, Rosie wanted to name the diner Rosie and Arthur's. You wouldn't let her, of course. Said it was all her doing. Mr. Thompson smiled, shaking his head. She was too generous. I was just happy to be a part of it. He took a bite of the apple pie, closing his eyes for a moment. Just as good as I remember. Rose's recipe, I presume. The very same, Joe replied, pride radiating from his face. Passed down through generations, with a little secret ingredient, Rose's love. Mark swallowed, the lump in his throat unexpectedly large. He suddenly understood. Mr. Thompson wasn't just some doddering old man. He was a piece of Rose's place, a part of its very foundation. And he, Mark, had treated him like dirt. Mark's apology. Joe, his face a thundercloud, gently guided Mr. Thompson back inside Rose's. Arthur, you shouldn't have to stand for that. Not here. He steered him towards his usual booth by the window, the worn vinyl creaking in protest as Mr. Thompson settled in. Coffee? On the house, of course. Mr. Thompson sighed, the weight of the earlier encounter still evident in his slumped shoulders. Thank you, Joe. I appreciate it. He watched the swirling steam rise from the fresh cup Joe placed before him, a fragile smile gracing his lips. Mark, meanwhile, felt a knot tightening in his stomach. He'd seen the disappointment etched on Mr. Thompson's face, the quiet dignity with which he'd accepted Mark's appalling behavior. Guilt gnawed at him, a sharp contrast to the fleeting satisfaction he'd felt earlier. He glanced at Joe, who was shooting daggers his way. He knew he had to do something, anything, to make amends. He wiped his hands on his apron, the rough fabric doing little to soothe his suddenly clammy palms. He walked towards Mr. Thompson's booth, his heart hammering against his ribs. Each step felt like wading through treacle. Mr. Thompson, he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Thompson looked up, his eyes, though aged, still held a spark of kindness. Yes, Mark. Mark swallowed hard. I wanted to apologize. For how I acted earlier. It was completely out of line, disrespectful. There's no excuse for it. The words tumbled out in a rush, clumsy and inadequate, yet sincere. He kept his gaze fixed on the worn linoleum floor, unable to meet Mr. Thompson's eyes. A silence hung in the air, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the clatter of dishes from the kitchen. Mark braced himself for a reprimand, a lecture, anything. Instead, Mr. Thompson reached out a frail hand and gently touched Mark's arm. Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that. His voice was soft, but firm. We all have our bad days. But it's how we choose to act, especially when we're feeling low, that defines us. He paused, taking a sip of his coffee. Life can be tough, son. I've seen a lot in my years. But bitterness, anger, they eat you up from the inside. They don't hurt anyone but yourself. He looked at Mark with an intensity that belied his gentle demeanor. Find something you enjoy, something that gives you purpose. It makes all the difference. Mark looked up, finally meeting Mr. Thompson's gaze. There was no anger there, only a quiet understanding and a genuine concern. He felt a flicker of hope ignite within him, a tiny spark in the darkness that had been consuming him. Thank you, Mr. Thompson, he said, the words catching in his throat. I will. He meant it. He didn't know what that something was yet, but he knew he couldn't continue down the path he'd been on. He felt a responsibility now, not just to Mr. Thompson, but to himself. Maybe, just maybe, he could start to turn things around. Roses restored. Mark took a deep breath, smoothing down his already smooth apron. He walked towards table 4, where Mr. Thompson sat patiently, a faded newspaper folded neatly beside his untouched water glass. This time, Mark held a small pad and a pen, his posture less a slouch and more a careful lean. Mr. Thompson, Mark began, his voice lower, almost hesitant. I'm really sorry about yesterday. It was unprofessional, and frankly, just plain rude of me. What can I get for you today? Mr. Thompson looked up, his blue eyes, the color of faded denim, crinkling at the corners. A ghost of a smile played on his lips. Apology accepted, young man. We all have our days. He picked up the menu, though Mark suspected he knew it by heart. Just the usual, Mark. Coffee and a slice of apple pie. Mark nodded, scribbling it down. Coming right up. He walked to the counter, avoiding Sarah's gaze. He could feel her watching him, assessing. He poured the coffee with deliberate care, adding a dollop of whipped cream to the pie. He even remembered the extra napkin Mr. Thompson always requested. As he placed the order in front of the elderly man, Mark noticed Mr. Thompson was struggling slightly to unfold his napkin. Without thinking, Mark reached over and unfolded it for him, placing it neatly in his lap. Mr. Thompson looked up, surprised. Thank you, Mark. That's very kind. Mark simply nodded, a genuine smile finally gracing his face. He retreated to the counter, where old Joe was polishing glasses, his eyes twinkling. That's more like it, son, Joe said, his voice a low rumble. Rosie wouldn't have stood for anything less. As Mr. Thompson took his first bite of pie, a slow smile spread across his face. He looked up at Mark, catching his eye. He raised his coffee cup slightly in a silent toast. Suddenly, a ripple of applause broke out from the other tables. Mark looked around, confused. Mrs. Henderson, a regular who always ordered the tuna melt, winked at him. Even a couple of truckers in the corner, who were usually engrossed in their own conversations, were clapping. Mark felt a flush creep up his neck. He didn't understand the applause, but it felt good. Mr. Thompson chuckled, a soft, wheezing sound. They appreciate kindness, Mark. And they appreciate seeing someone learn from their mistakes. He took another bite of pie. This is the best apple pie in town, you know. Rose's recipe, of course. The diner buzzed with a renewed energy. Laughter filled the air, and the clatter of plates and silverware was a comforting symphony. Sarah, her face softened, brought Mark a fresh pot of coffee. You did good, Mark, she said quietly, bumping his shoulder with hers. Mark watched as Mr. Thompson finished his pie, savoring each bite. He paid his bill, leaving a generous tip. As he walked towards the door, he turned back to Mark. Thank you, Mark, he said, his voice clear and strong. For restoring Roses. With a final nod, Mr. Thompson stepped out into the afternoon sun, leaving behind a diner filled with warmth and a waiter who, for the first time in a long time, felt a flicker of hope. The air in Roses once again smelled of coffee, apple pie, and something else intangible, contentment. Mark knew he had a long way to go, but he had taken the first step. He grabbed a rag and started wiping down the counter, a sense of purpose settling over him. Maybe, just maybe, he could find his place here, at Roses.